Hey friends, welcome back to Tech Tuesdays. It is that time of the year. Again, we are doing the much requested video of which iPad should you buy in 2022. There are 5 to choose from. You have the basic ass budget iPad. There is the iPad Air, there is the iPad mini, there is the 11-inch iPad Pro, and there is the 12.9-inch iPad Pro. So as usual, we're gonna start with an upfront conclusion where I tell you what I think about these. Then we're gonna talk about the idea of diminishing returns and the consumer to creator spectrum, which kind of dictates which of these 5 iPads you should go for. And then one at a time, we're gonna go over the pros and cons of each of the iPads, and I'm gonna tell you why I personally use an iPad mini rather than any of the other fancier ones. So let's start things off with the upfront conclusion, and that is that if you are broadly a consumer of stuff, i.e. you watch things, you maybe do the occasional Google Doc here and there, but broadly your iPad is a consumption device, for you I would recommend the basic iPad, which is a fantastic option if you're a student as well, or the iPad mini. Moving along the spectrum, if you are a light creator or a student, then broadly the iPad Air is a good option for you. And the iPad Pros, the 11-inch and the 12.9-inch models, so this one and this one, those are only really ideal if you are a kind of professional and you know that you need the power of something like the M1 chip, which is, I suspect, not what 99.9% of people out there actually need. So that was the upfront conclusion to hopefully save you time. If that's all you wanted, then feel free to drop a like on the video on the way out and maybe consider subscribing to the channel. But now let's talk about this stuff in more detail. And let's start by talking about this idea of the consumer to creator spectrum. So there is this thing in all of tech. It's just like, are you a consumer or are you a creator? It's sort of like a spectrum. A consumer is someone who tends to watch things or read things like, you know, Netflix, spends most of the time in a web browser, maybe watches some YouTube videos, maybe listens to some Spotify, maybe listens to some podcasts, maybe reads a book on Kindle or reads articles on Instapaper or on Safari or on Chrome or whatever. It's broadly a consumption-y type person. Then as we go further along the spectrum towards the creator/professional category, we have people who, most people are kind of in that middle camp where you're kind of using your iPad for some consumption stuff, but also for some like creation stuff. Maybe you're typing Word documents here and there. Maybe you're making presentations. Maybe you're an artist and you're sketching some stuff. Maybe you're a student and you're taking typed out or handwritten notes. That puts you square in the middle of the consumer to creator spectrum. And then all the way on the creator or pro side of the spectrum, we have people who need things like 3D modeling, people who do advanced, like, I don't know, video gaming, people who do stuff like rendering massive files in Photoshop, or music producers who have like zillions of tracks running. For those sorts of people, they are on the creator/professional end of the spectrum. So it's generally useful to know where you land on the spectrum because it helps you figure out how much money you should actually pay for stuff. If you're on the consumer end, you don't need to buy tools that are designed for the professionals and the creators, but if you're a professional creator, you kind of know it and you know you have to spend more money on the things that you want. So that was one of the principles. The other principle that really comes in when valuing iPads is the idea of diminishing returns, which is that as you spend more money on an iPad, you actually get less and less return for your money spent. So for example, if you just buy the basic iPad for £319, that gives you, I would suggest, roughly 88% of the value of the iPad experience. Spend an extra £160 on the iPad mini and you go up to 92%. I think these are just my numbers off kind of my own personal experience. Spend an extra £100 and go for the iPad Air and you go up to 95%. Paying an extra £170 then takes you from 95 to 98% with the 11-inch Pro. And then paying an extra £250 takes you from 98 to 100% with the 12.9-inch M1 iPad Pro with the, I don't know, fancy XDR display that they've got on it. So you can see we've got this sort of curve where the more money you spend, the less value per unit money spent you're getting from the iPad. And a graph like this is particularly important because when we're asking, is the iPad Air worth it or is the iPad Pro worth it? It kind of depends. It's just like, well, objectively no, because you're paying a lot more for a very, very small percentage increase in utility or usefulness or whatever. But the question of whether something is worth it actually does depend on how much money you have, how much money you have to burn, because that dictates whether, you know, is it worth it to spend £1.50 on a can of Coke when you could just get water at home? Like, I don't know, like it just depends on how you personally value money, and there is no one answer to the question of is something worth it. So far, what we've arrived at is basically that the budget iPad for £319 gives you the vast majority of the value of having an iPad. So if you are on a budget, honestly, this is the one I'd recommend. It's still really good. It looks a bit old-fashioned compared to the newer models, but to be honest, the budget iPad is pretty sick. And especially if you're a student on a budget, this is the one that I would recommend broadly without reservation. With the new model that was released in September 2021, they now have support for the Apple Smart Keyboard. So you could add an Apple Smart Keyboard if you want, although Logitech and other brands have a bunch of third-party accessories, which are pretty good as well. And if you're on a budget, you probably don't want to spend, I think, like 100 or 150 quid for the Apple version of the keyboard. And this one has the A13 processor, which is a few years old at this point. But again, if you're a student, if you're on the lighter creator or consumer end of the spectrum, you're not really going to notice the difference between a £300 processor, A13, and a £1,300 like M1 processor. You just will not notice any kind of difference between the two. Having said that, there are a few drawbacks of the budget iPad. Firstly is the design. Like, it still has the old design that has the home button, and so it's less bezel-less than, for example, the new iPad Air is. It's also got a 10.2-inch non-laminated display. What that basically means is that there's a bit more of an air gap between the screen and the stuff underneath. It's not massively relevant, you don't really notice it, but if you're writing with an Apple Pencil a lot, you might notice, and if you have like an iPad Air or an iPad Pro side by side, then you may well notice some slight difference. Again, I don't think it's a big enough difference to justify spending an extra 200 quid on the iPad Air just for the sake of that laminated air gap, but it is something that is noticeable about the iPad budget if you hold it side by side with other iPads. The other annoying thing is that this is compatible with the Apple Pencil Generation 1, which means if you want to charge the Apple Pencil, you can stick it out of your iPad like this. This is not a very aesthetic way to charge an Apple Pencil, whereas with the other models, it's the Apple Pencil Generation 2, and so you can charge it magnetically alongside the iPad, which is just a much nicer way of dealing with pencil charging. Having said that, recently they have included this adapter with the Apple Pencil Series 1. So what you can do is you can put this lightning to lightning adapter on the back of it, and then you can just charge this via a lightning cable, which is what you can charge your iPhone with, or in fact, your budget iPad with, because this still uses lightning rather than USB-C. That's not a huge concern, like lightning cable for the pencil, lightning cable for the iPad, but it's just a slight difference between the USB-C compatible version of the iPad Air and the iPad Mini and the iPad Pro. So conclusion, if you are on any kind of budget at all, I would fully recommend the budget iPad. It's genuinely really good. It gets you 88% of the value of an iPad without having to pay too much for it, and it starts at £319, and we'll put the dollar price here as well. All right, so let's put that aside. Next up, we have the next one, which is the iPad Air. Now, the iPad Air is a £260 upgrade over the iPad budget. This starts at £579, again, dollar price here. And overall, this is a really good middle ground iPad. Yes, you're paying quite a lot more. You're paying almost double the price of the budget iPad, but there are things about the iPad Air that make it a pretty compelling alternative to the budget iPad. And what you get because of these slightly reduced bezels is that in basically the same form factor of the budget iPad, you get a very slightly larger screen. So this is 10.9 inch rather than the 10.2 inch on the budget iPad. The great thing about the iPad Air is that it has support for the Apple Pencil Generation 2, which means you can charge an Apple Pencil by sticking it on the side, which is just very convenient. And the Apple Pencil Generation 2 is just a nicer feeling Apple Pencil. It feels a little bit more kind of like matte plastic rather than glossy plastic compared to Generation 1. It also has this like ridge on it, which means it's not gonna fall off the table. And when I was a student and I used the Apple Pencil Generation 1, it would always just end up like rolling off the table, which was just like super annoying. Whereas this one, it rolls a bit and then it stops rolling because it's got this like ridge on it. So Apple Pencil 2 is a bit of an upgrade over the Apple Pencil 1. The display quality is apparently better than the budget iPad, and it does feel less plasticky. It feels more like a premium product because this is a laminated rather than non-laminated display. But again, unless you hold them up side by side, this isn't really a thing that you're gonna notice on the daily. The iPad Air also has USB-C support. So for example, if you have a MacBook and you charge it via USB-C, and you have an iPad, you can charge it via USB-C. Although generally people with iPads also have iPhones, and so Lightning versus USB-C is not a huge difference there. But if you do want to use third-party accessories, it's generally easier to find USB-C accessories for the iPad Air than it is to find Lightning compatible accessories for the budget iPad. Although again, I've been using iPads for like 5+ years at this point, and I've basically never needed to plug in an extra accessory because the iPad just does the job completely fine on its own. So the question here is the iPad Air worth it compared to the budget iPad? Is it worth spending an extra £260 on upgrading to the iPad Air for the sake of a new design, a slightly upgraded Apple Pencil, and a slightly different connectivity in USB-C? Again, it just depends on how much money you have to burn. Like I said, if you're on any kind of budget, you get 88% of the value of an iPad from the budget iPad. And yes, you could pay an extra like 80% more for the iPad Air, but you're only getting an extra 7% value in my kind of subjective estimation of values of an iPad. And so it's really hard to answer this question of is it worth it? You just have to decide for yourself. Is it worth spending an extra 80% cash to get an extra 7% improvement? I don't know. I would personally, but I have more money to burn and I can buy these as a business expense. And so it really just depends on what your personal circumstances are.
All right, newsflash. As of yesterday, the iPad Air now has the M1 processor, which makes it a significant speed jump from the budget iPad. But that doesn't really change the question of whether it's worth it, because M1 versus A13 versus A14, I mean, for most people who are in that middle band of the spectrum, so like semi-consumer, semi-creator, you're not gonna bump into the limits of an A13 or A14 processor anyway. And so the upgrade to the M1 processor shouldn't be a major factor. It's like, oh my God, it's such a speed jump from the iPad budget to the iPad Air. Having said that, the fact that the iPad Air now has M1 means that you are likely to get a longevity upgrade. So going from A13 to M1 your iPad Air is likely to last longer. So if you're looking to buy something which is then going to last you for the long term, you might want to consider the iPad Air rather than the budget iPad, even though it's an extra £260 difference between the two.
So that was the budget iPad and the iPad Air. Let's now talk about the iPad mini, which is the one that I actually have now as my daily driver. Now, the iPad mini is a bit of a weird addition to this lineup. It was always one that's sort of a bit on the side, but the iPad mini is actually £100 cheaper than the iPad Air. And it's kind of similar in that it's got the same kind of design, but the form factor of the iPad mini is obviously like this, and it's very much holdable in one hand. And basically the way I think of the iPad mini is that it's basically a glorified Kindle. So I like using the iPad mini for reading books or reading scientific papers when I'm on the go. I'm in the process of writing a book right now, so I have to read a bunch of papers, and it's much easier reading those on the iPad mini because I can read it with one hand, I can read it on the train, I can read it on Ubers, I can read it in public transport, I can read it in cafes. And there's just something about it holding an iPad Air, holding an iPad mini, that makes it just feel more manageable than holding an iPad Air. Like, you have to hold this in two hands and you kind of need to rest on something. It feels a bit uncomfortable. Whereas the iPad mini, it's so nice. It's just very much hand holdable in one hand, and therefore makes it better for me, at least as a consumption device. Now, I wouldn't really use this as a creation device. I wouldn't recommend the iPad mini if you're like a light creator. I would recommend more of the bigger sized iPads, especially if you're gonna do things like illustration or taking notes. But I think if you are gonna use the iPad as basically a glorified Kindle or a glorified, I don't know, Netflix machine, then actually the iPad mini is a really solid option. Annoyingly, there isn't really a first party kind of smart keyboard attachment for this. I think that would have been nice. I would have used this as like a portable book writing-y, typing-y, note-taking device on the go. But actually you can get a bunch of these small Bluetooth keyboards, and I've got one which sadly I forgot to bring to the studio with me today. It's in my bedroom at home. I've got one of those that I occasionally use to type stuff on the iPad mini. But again, that's a bit of a niche use case. If I need to actually do some typing, I will just get out my 14-inch MacBook Pro and just use that, because it's so much easier than trying to fiddle with typing on an iPad. Unless of course you have Magic Keyboard or things like that, but then you're getting into the extra paying an extra £300 for that kind of thing. So should you go for the iPad mini or should you go for the iPad Air? I think really the decision just comes down to the form factor. Do you need a smaller iPad? Would you like a smaller iPad, or do you want something bigger? Now, the reason I personally go for the iPad mini is because the iPad does not replace my laptop. I have a MacBook, which I literally carry everywhere I go. This is the 14-inch M1 Pro MacBook Pro. It's literally in my bag all the time, and I just know I have to carry it everywhere I go. I really don't go anywhere without this. And I've actually had the 11-inch iPad Pro in my bag for the last few months at the same time as the MacBook Pro, but I just never use the iPad Pro or the iPad Air. Like, when you have the option of getting a MacBook out and you have to do some quote proper work, I would just never use an iPad when I could use the MacBook. And so for me, there's really no point in having this kind of middle ground 10.9 or 11-inch iPad when I have my MacBook for real stuff. But there is actually a point in having like a glorified Kindle in my bag. I can just chuck it in, it's very lightweight. I kind of forget that it's there. But if I do want to take it out and I'm in a circumstance like in a cramped cafe or in a library or in a public transport where taking out my MacBook is a bit overkill, I can just take out the iPad mini and I can read some stuff, which is awesome. Next, we come to the 11-inch iPad Pro. Now, this is one I've had in my bag for the last few months, but as I said, I almost never even take it out because I've got the MacBook, and it is really nice. It's just very expensive. It's £750, and it's such a beautiful, glorious device that I, have gotten a reasonable amount of use out of. But again, it's hard to justify when you have a MacBook and you have an iPhone. Like, why would you need an 11-inch iPad as well? At least for me. That's just how I feel about it. Maybe your use cases would differ, but I think most things that you can do on an iPad Pro, you can also do on the iPad Air. You can also do on the budget iPad. It just depends on how much money you want to spend. And yes, the iPad Pro does have the new M1 processor, as does the iPad Pro 12.9-inch. But again, realistically, for the vast majority of people, you're never going to notice a difference in performance between the A13 chip, the A14 chip, or the M1 chip. I certainly have never noticed. I've been dabbling with these iPads for a while, switching iPads here and there. I just never noticed a speed improvement. The only difference I noticed with the iPad Pros is the fact that they have an incredible display with the 120 Hertz ProMotion thing, which makes the display like super, super smooth. And the annoying thing about all the other iPads, the non-Pro ones, is that they only have 60 Hertz displays. Now, this difference between 60 Hertz and 120 Hertz, it's annoyingly noticeable. But it's only noticeable again if you've used a Pro, then you are very used to what the beautiful buttery smoothness of the iPad Pro display. It just looks freaking incredible. Whereas if you then switch to an iPad mini or an iPad Air like I've done, and you scroll around the screen, you notice that, something about this just feels bad. It just doesn't feel as nice. It doesn't look as nice. Now, if the iPad mini had the option of a 120 Hertz ProMotion display, I would be buying this in a heartbeat, because that's my only beef with the iPad mini, that it doesn't have that ProMotion display. In fact, if they had an iPad Pro and they just shrunk it to the form factor of an iPad mini, I would be like, take my money. This is the absolute perfect iPad for my personal use cases. But yeah, I just cannot get enough of the 120 Hertz ProMotion display. Is this a good enough reason to buy the iPad Pro? I don't think so. I think it's mostly an aesthetic preference, and it's good, for example, if you're an artist and you actually notice the difference between drawing with an Apple Pencil on 60 Hertz versus drawing with an Apple Pencil on 120 Hertz. These ones also now have Face ID. It's kind of nice, but Face ID versus Touch ID on the side doesn't really make much difference to my life. And the good news is this has 128 gigabytes of storage as standard, whereas the other ones have 64 gigabytes as standard. And you know, in the past I used to hate on 64 gigabytes, but actually I now have a 64 gigabyte iPad, and I've realized that I very rarely store anything locally because cloud storage options have become so cheap and so good these days, and I have fast internet basically everywhere I go. And so 64 gigabytes is actually reasonable, but it's kind of nice that for the extra 200 and 300 quid you're paying for the iPad Pro, you are getting a little bit extra storage as well. So is the iPad Pro worth it? I would say for most people, probably not. If you're the sort of person that needs the performance of the M1 chip, you already know that you need the performance of the M1 chip. And so this review of me as someone who is not someone who needs the performance of the M1 chip shouldn't really sway your decision one way or another. But hey, it's kind of nice to have. If you have the money to burn, and let's say you're a student and you've just got rich parents, or you've got a side hustle, or you just have loads of money, then 11-inch iPad Pro is actually sick. If it's non-trivial for you to spend an extra, I don't know, 300 quid to upgrade from the iPad Air for 579 to the iPad Pro for 749, then go for the iPad Pro. You won't regret it. The ProMotion display is really, really nice. But again, it just depends on what sort of budget you're at. It is an extra 3% gain for an extra 80% cost or like 70% cost. It's objectively not worth it, but it just depends on how much money you have to burn on the purchase of an iPad. Oh, and now that the iPad Air also has the M1 chip, the reason you're upgrading to the iPad Pro, I mean, it's mostly for the screen and for the build quality. It's not really for the chip itself. And so the fact that the iPad Air now has the M1 chip makes it even less of a need to upgrade to the iPad Pro. But if you know you need an iPad Pro and you need to have, and you know that you need to have one this generation, you already need that anyway, and you probably don't need this video to explain it. And then we come to the big daddy, the 12.9 iPad Pro. Now this actually used to be my daily driver. I used to use this a lot. I used to use this a lot when I was at the hospital, when I was at work, for planning videos and things. But that was before the M1 MacBooks came out. Now that the M1 MacBooks are here, it's like, you know, a 13 or 14-inch MacBook Pro versus 12.9-inch iPad Pro. Even though I've got this and I've got it with a Magic Keyboard and all the accessories and stuff, I just never find myself reaching for the 12.9-inch iPad Pro when I could just be using my MacBook. People always ask the question, can an iPad replace your laptop? And I still think 5 years later, the answer to that question is no, not really. It's very hard to fully replace your laptop with an iPad because the iPad, at the end of the day, is just an iPad. It does still have the limitations of iPad OS. It's not a proper desktop operating system. The iPad Pro 12.9 is very nice. It's got the same processors and stuff as the 11-inch iPad Pro, but it does have a slightly nicer screen, which has slightly more contrasty blacks. Again, you never notice this unless you're looking at them side by side. I watch things on the iPad Pro sometimes, I watch things on the iPad mini. I never think to myself, oh God, the blacks on this don't look as black as they did on the iPad Pro, unless I'm doing a review and looking at them side by side. And that's a very artificial, unfair way to test iPads. And there's a bunch of creators I know on the internet who use the 12.9-inch iPad Pro. There's like music producers that plug devices in and they like having 12.9 inches, and this is like their go-to device for making music. I'm not one of those people. If you're watching this video, I would hazard a guess that you're probably not one of those people either. And so I would, and again, unless you just have loads of money to burn and you really, really want a 12.9-inch huge ass screen, maybe with the Magic Keyboard, it's just very hard to justify spending all this money on an iPad Pro 12.9-inch. So where are we at the end of all this? Like I said, my daily driver is now the iPad mini. I don't need an iPad because I have a MacBook to do quote real work, but it's nice having the iPad mini as a glorified Kindle, as a consumption device that I can use one-handed. I can just chuck it into my bag and I can use it whenever I'm on the go. If I were a student and I had absolutely no money at all, I wouldn't even get an iPad because an iPad is not a game changer for your university life. Save your money, use it for something else. But if I were a student and was on some kind of budget and I wanted to spend some money on tech, maybe I wanted to go paperless with my notes and do handwritten note-taking on the iPad, I would go for the budget iPad if I was on a budget. If I had an extra 300 quid to spare, I would go for the iPad Air just because the conveniences of the Apple Pencil, USB-C, and the new design is kind of nice. And if I was a real baller of a student and I had like a side hustle and stuff and I had a business that I could funnel business expenses through, or I just had really rich parents and stuff, I would probably go for the 11-inch iPad Pro just because why not at that point. But yeah, it just sort of depends, diminishing returns. You know where you're on the spectrum and you can decide from that, hopefully, what's the best iPad for you. This iPad mini is the one for me. By the way, if you're getting an iPad, you should totally put a paper-like screen protector on it. They're not sponsoring this video, but I'll put an affiliate link in the video description if you want to check it out. I have been using these guys since like 2017 was when I first got a paper-like screen protector, and it's been on my iPad ever since. It's just really good. And if you like this video, you might like to check out this video over here, which talks about my top favorite apps for the iPad, because obviously the device is one thing, but it's really all about the apps, and that video goes over all my favorite apps for the iPad. So thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you found this video useful. Do hit the subscribe button if you aren't already, and I'll see you hopefully in the next video. Bye-bye.